So today we're going to discuss compassion, the second of the skillful emotions that we should practice in the Brahmaviharas, coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing. So compassion for others. This is something that we may feel from time to time that we're deficient in. I know that I do myself, that I feel that I should be more compassionate than I am, that I reflect upon my own emotional involvement in the world, and I feel like compassion is one of those that I can work on. And so this kind of practice, I think, at least for me, has been useful, as have all of the Brahmavihara practices. This is the second one of 4. And if we look also, in fact, at the history of early Buddhism and the Buddha's own move toward, from being an ordinary human to being an awakened being, as it were, to being somebody who is awakened, which is what Buddha means, we're going to find an important transition at that point. It's said in all traditions that Buddhas, that awakened beings teach out of compassion for others, but as the great scholar Analayo has pointed out, what we find if we look at the Buddha's own path towards awakening, as recorded in the early texts, we don't find compassion being a reason for his journey, for his search. Compassion becomes very important later on in, let's say, the Mahayana, where it's discussed how bodhisattvas, that is, beings who are approaching awakening or looking to become awakened, do so out of compassion, that they put off their awakening in order to save other beings out of compassion. And it's said that all Buddhas do this, that they go through this stage of compassion for all beings before they become Buddhas. But that seems to be a story that arose later on in the tradition, because the early story is one of the bodhisattva, in this case Gautama, leaving home, leaving the palace, presumably, or at least so from the story says, because he was, for want of a better word, sort of depressed. He was trying to find himself. He was not happy. He seems to have been racked with various kinds of emotional troubles and problems, questions that had been unanswered, and that he wanted answers to. And those are the reasons he seems to have left home. And once he became awakened, he says that he seriously considered not teaching at all, because teaching would become a burden to him. It's difficult, he realized that the lessons that he was going to give, or that he had found for himself, would be difficult for people, that people wouldn't want to hear them, that they would tend to turn away, that it would be very difficult to convince everybody, and he thought that it was just too much of a trouble. And so in the early texts it said that a god came down to him, Brahma Sahampati came down to him and basically begged him to teach people because some people would be able to learn from it. And it's said that the Buddha relented and said, okay, yes, I will teach for the benefit of all. And so in this case, if we see this story, obviously it's got mythic elements. We can't take necessarily the whole thing seriously, but the general thrust of it, the general aim of it, is to say that the compassion to teach is something that arose in the Buddha after he became awakened. So that the awakening sort of caused to arise within him the compassion that he needed later on. And indeed, in the early texts, the main vehicle of compassion is teaching the Dhamma, teaching the Buddha Dhamma. That is, we can be compassionate, of course, in an infinite number of different ways. We can give money, we can give alms, food, lodging to people. We can do things for them. We can be nice to people. We can be compassionate by behaving in an ethical way. But the highest form of compassion, the main vehicle of the compassion in the early texts, was teaching. Because it was said to be the most compassionate thing you could do. Of course, you could be compassionate in many ways, but the most compassionate you can be is by teaching the Dhamma. And I think the reasoning behind this is sort of like the old statement about give a man a fish and you'll feed him for a day, and teach him how to fish and you'll feed him for a lifetime. The idea, being that, of course, you can be nice to somebody in a temporary fashion, but to be nice to them in a permanent fashion, it's the best we can do is to sort of turn their minds in the direction of wisdom. So that said, there are three. I'll go through three different practices of compassion meditation. They're similar to those we've found before if you've watched my video on loving kindness meditation in the context of the Brahmaviharas. So we'll begin with the early tradition. In the early tradition, we can go by a very standard formula for compassion meditation, which goes something like this. Meditate spreading a heart full of compassion to one direction and to the second, and to the third, and to the fourth. In the same way, above, below, across, everywhere, all around, spread a heart full of compassion to the whole world, abundant, expansive, limitless, free of enmity and ill will. So although this is a wonderful paragraph, many of us may think that it's a really pretty compressed kind of practice. In particular, what do we mean by compassion? What sort of emotional state are we trying to generate when we generate compassion? There's one big, I would say, important distinction to make, particularly, well, with the English word compassion, which comes from the words compassio, which means to feel the same passion as. And that suggests a state that we might actually better translate or understand as empathy than compassion. Empathy is feeling the same emotional state as somebody else. In that sense, if somebody is in pain, we're supposed to feel their pain. If somebody is very angry, we feel their anger. And in that way, we sort of come to terms with them. We sort of come to the same place as them in a sense of understanding where they are. And that is where compassion practice eventually went to in much of Buddhism. I did an earlier video on that, which I'll put up a link to up on the screen if you want to hear more about that. I'm not going to go into too much detail about that here. But what I will say is that in the early practice, that's not what we do. Instead, compassion practice is a practice that is exclusively joyful. It's a happy practice. It's a practice of wishing the best for others who are suffering. It's a practice of wishing and hoping that those who are in places of need and suffering will get better. They will turn whatever corner they need to turn. They will get to a better place. And with the overcoming of suffering, in the sense that we're focusing on the overcoming of suffering rather than the sharing of suffering, the emotion of compassion should be the sort of thing, the sort of emotion that gets us, that motivates us to act. It should be, if it's correctly practiced, and this is something that many modern Buddhist teachers have said, including the Dalai Lama, as I recall, is that the compassion is really only properly practiced if it finds some kind of actual work in the world to an extent, to whatever extent it works for us, of course. And different people are going to have different ways of doing that. And we'll get to some of that. But in any event, it's a positive practice. It's a joyful practice. It can be thought of as metta or loving kindness extended to those who are suffering. Extended, in other words, not towards all the world, but towards a part of the world. Now, that's a little overstated, in fact, because in the Buddhist understanding, everybody except those who are awakened is suffering. That we are all, if we recall the First Noble Truth, the truth of suffering or of unsatisfactoriness, what's called in Pali dukkha, all beings who are not awakened have this feeling of unsatisfactoriness, that they're in a world that is not completely satisfactory, that even if they're happy, that happiness will come to an end. And so, to an extent, everybody in the world is suffering to one degree or another. And so, if we practice compassion, we can indeed practice compassion towards all beings, or virtually all beings, every being except those that are awakened. So that's the early practice. Now, The practice that is one of the more famous ones is we find in the Visuddhimagga, which is a 5th century of the Common Era text by Buddhaghosa. And we will recall a similar kind of practice from loving kindness, if we've heard about that. In loving kindness practice, Buddhaghosa has us begin with ourselves, because to his understanding, it's easiest to generate kindness towards yourself. In compassion practice, however, he does not begin with the self. He begins with an unfortunate person. And here again, as with the prior case of loving kindness, what Buddhaghosa does, instead of just sort of generating the mental state or the emotional state without any kind of specificity in the world, just extending it out towards the entire world without boundary, here we are in fact being very specific. We're going to say, find somebody in your life who is in a state of real sadness, of suffering, of misfortune. They should be somebody that you know, that you've seen. It doesn't have to be you know them personally. It could be somebody that you see on the street. Perhaps you pass every day, or you pass them regularly. Maybe they're a homeless person, or maybe it's somebody in your life with bad illness, or who's lost a loved one, or whatever it might be. Take somebody who you think is particularly suffering in a bad state, and begin with them. Interestingly, Buddhaghosa also says that if you can't think of such a person, if you don't have anybody in your life who is suffering in that way, you can also turn to a person who is doing a great deal of evil in the world. And to me, that seems pretty wild. I would have trouble generating a feeling of compassion towards somebody who's doing great evil. But in Buddhaghosa's understanding, which of course comes from traditional Buddhism, somebody who's doing a great deal of evil in the world is going to suffer for it. If not in this life, then in the next life. Because the traditional notion of karma, of course, is of perfect justice. And so whatever evil you're going to do, you're going to be punished for it. And so in that kind of mindset, it may indeed make sense to you, if that's the way you practice, if that's the way you view the world from that traditional perspective, then indeed that is one option, is just to take somebody who's doing a great deal of evil right now and have compassion for them because of what they're going to be experiencing in the future. Now, of course, we can also have compassion for an evil person simply because we believe right now that anybody who does that kind of evil must be coming from a place of great suffering internally. That's, I would submit, usually the case, is that people who do great evil tend to come from places of great suffering and sadness in their own lives, or even just in their own psychology, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to do those kinds of things. So yes, that is one way of practicing, of beginning the practice. And from there, this is the first one, of course. This is just the first person we look at in Buddhaghosa's understanding. Then we go to a dear person. So we have compassion for a dear person, for whatever problems are going on in the life of a dear person near us, a dear friend, a benefactor, whatever it might be. And then if we can generate that kind of compassion for them and sustain it, then we can turn to a neutral person, a person that we perhaps don't know their name, we don't know much about them. They're not going to be the first person we've already looked at who might be neutral. Might be somebody we don't know either. This is just somebody on the street, just some random person that we know, or that we don't know, but that we have seen. And there, of course, they're standing in sort of for everybody, for all of the world of the people that we don't know. And just extending compassion to them as another suffering human being, to them as another human being in this imperfect world of samsara. And then finally, fourth, to a hostile person. And again, having compassion for them, even if they're hostile to us, even if they may have done us wrong in some way, thinking of them as another human being, as somebody who, again, just as we saw in the first case, perhaps they did those bad things because they're coming from a place of sadness in their own life, of suffering in their own psychology. And so having compassion for them and extending that sort of compassion out in their direction. And interestingly, Buddhaghosa doesn't mention having compassion for yourself in this practice. We'll recall that he began with the self in the metta practice, in the practice on loving kindness, but here the self is not mentioned at all. And I don't know the reason for that, but what I would say is that many people nowadays feel it important in the West to have compassion for yourself, particularly insofar as we may see ourselves psychologically suffering. We may feel ill will towards ourselves or hatred towards ourselves. So seeing compassion towards ourselves can be a skillful way of sort of undoing that ill will, because we begin to see ourselves in a different light, in the same way we might have compassion for an enemy of ourselves, or somebody that we think of as antagonistic. So if you find also to add a practice for compassion or self-compassion here, then go right ahead. Put it wherever you find it most useful, either at the beginning if you are really suffering and really feel that you can generate compassion easily. Put it towards the end if perhaps it's more difficult for you to generate that compassion. So that's another option. And in each of these cases, Buddhaghosa suggests we have a kind of a mantra. We have a sort of a phrase that we say to ourselves to generate the right mental state. We say to ourselves, let's just take the first case where we think of some particular person who's suffering that we know in our lives, and we say, may that person be free from suffering. May that person overcome his or her difficulties. And you put the name of whoever it is. The same with a friend, the same with a neutral person. If we don't know the neutral person's name, which we probably won't know their name, we just say, may they be happy. That is to say, may they be free from suffering. May they overcome their difficulties. And here, I said, may they be happy, which is actually the loving kindness mantra, but it's similar. It's a similar kind of approach, where the idea is to be joyful. May they overcome their suffering. May they overcome their problems. May they get better. May they get healthy. May they see a road towards happiness in the future. May they overcome the sadness of their loss. Whatever it might be, whatever words work for you to get across the right emotional state of a joyful kind of wish for their betterment in the future. That's the kind of mantra, of sort of statement that you should consider saying to yourself quietly during meditation. And so we've seen an early practice which didn't involve any kind of words, just involved a generation of an emotional state and a broadcasting of it. We saw Buddhaghosa's practice of basically using mantras to direct targeted emotional states towards particular people and to use that as a way of breaking down barriers. And there's also a more sort of, I would say, modern, I don't know exactly where it comes from, contemporary practice, which is similar to the Buddhaghosa's, where we have a mantra, but we use the word all instead of particular people. So we can say, may all of my family and friends overcome their difficulties. May all of the people in my country overcome their difficulties and get better. May all beings overcome their difficulties. And these are mantras that we can, again, say to ourselves to try to extend loving kindness, or not loving kindness, but compassion in greater and greater degrees around all of experienced reality. May all beings be free from suffering, which is a great mantra that is used into the Mahayana as a sort of a bodhisattva kind of vow. May all beings be free from suffering. That's a kind of a universalized approach towards compassion that really does resonate with many different Buddhist communities and Buddhist practices down the years. And the practice of compassion is an antidote towards certain less skillful states, mental states, or attitudes that we might have. It's an antidote towards pity to begin with. Now, pity being a close cousin to compassion, but pity is an emotion where we are looking down on those who are suffering as being somehow beneath us, as their suffering makes them less than we are, or that they're suffering for some reason that is their own fault, as it were. And so we sort of, our compassion is tinged with a certain kind of feeling better than them, of comparison in that sense. And that is not the right kind of mental state. That is a less skillful mental state. And so compassion can be an antidote to pity. It can also be an antidote towards a kind of hard-heartedness or stinginess in our own approach to the world, and in particular in our own approach towards human suffering. And I think for many of us, we will naturally approach human suffering in a more empathetic way, that is, tending towards wanting to share the other person's pain. But when we do that, when we come from that kind of approach, for many of us, that can lead towards hard-heartedness, because what happens is we get hurt. We hear somebody in pain, we immediately rush to share that pain. I know this is sort of the way I tend, I think, psychologically to deal with these things. Immediately start to share the pain, immediately start suffering myself, ourselves, extended towards other people. Maybe you've experienced the same thing. And as a result, you sort of feel like you've been burned. And so when you hear other people who are suffering, there tends to be a sort of a barrier that's erected, a protective barrier against our own suffering, which leads in the medium to longer term, towards a kind of hard-heartedness towards the world. I don't want to share your pain because I've got enough of it myself, even though frankly I don't. I mean, in other words, I'm not suffering in the way that so many other people are. But that's the sort of mental attitude that comes up. And so in that sense, this practice of compassion, of a joyful practice of compassion, can be a way of sort of getting over that wall, of seeing another way towards helping from a place of joy and happiness and positivity, as they say, a sort of a positive energy, if you like, rather than from a place of our own suffering, which can be for many of us a difficult place to come from. So let me know if you have any questions about compassion or these various three different practices and all the different points I've made here. It may be something that you find easy to practice or not. I'd be interested to hear. Thanks so much to all of my subscribers. Thanks to all my patrons over on Patreon. It wouldn't be possible without your help and without us all working together. So thanks so much, and I hope we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. And meanwhile, be well.